The silence in Adrian Vance's office was expensive.
It was the sound of air conditioning humming over solid gold wiring, the soft give of imported Italian leather, and the heavy weight of a sealed manila envelope placed deliberately on a highly polished mahogany desk. Adrian was sterile. He had been since he was 18. Yet the woman he loved, the woman sleeping upstairs in his penthouse, was 3 months pregnant. The truth did not require shouting or anger. It simply arrived, clinical and cold, shattering the precisely calibrated world he had built, leaving behind only the question of who knew this impossible truth before he did.
Adrian Vance understood control. At 36, he controlled nearly $5 billion in assets, half a dozen subsidiary companies, and the narrative surrounding his own existence.
He wore bespoke suits tailored to conceal every vulnerability, spoke in measured tones that never betrayed doubt, and structured his life according to spreadsheets that predicted outcomes with alarming accuracy.
The one variable he could not control, the one element threatening to destabilize the delicate scaffolding of his conglomerate, Vance Capital, was perception.
The board of directors, specifically the old guard led by the perpetually skeptical Roger Thorne, saw Adrian as a brilliant but solitary wolf.
They believed stability required a cornerstone, a family unit, something permanent to anchor the future stock valuation against market volatility. They wanted a wife, not a companion, but an institutional presence. Adrian despised the notion, but the upcoming merger with Omnicorp was too critical to jeopardize. He needed the board's unified vote, and so he decided to acquire a wife the same way he acquired assets, through a rigorous, non-emotional contract.
He did not advertise. He engaged a discreet private firm that specialized in high-level, unusual transactions. He needed someone presentable, intelligent, and critically, someone desperate enough to adhere to every non-disclosure and exit clause.
This is how Elora Vance, née Hayes, entered his life. She was 24, working 2 service jobs to pay down crushing student and medical debt incurred by her ailing mother. She was not the polished socialite Adrian's peers expected. She was sharp, grounded, and possessed eyes that watched the world with a weary, practiced pragmatism.
The initial meeting was held in the sterile environment of Adrian's corporate legal offices. Elora wore the only suit jacket she owned, slightly too large in the shoulders.
Adrian laid out the terms: a 2-year commitment, a shared residence in the penthouse, defined public appearances, and an immediate, substantial lump sum payment sufficient to erase all her financial burdens. "The agreement is strictly professional, Miss Hayes," Adrian stated, his voice flat, leaning back against the cool leather of his chair. "You will be Mrs. Vance in public. You will have separate quarters. There will be no intimacy.
You are fulfilling a necessary corporate function. When the contract expires, you receive the remainder of the compensation, and we file for an amicable, quiet dissolution. Your life returns to normal, only without the—"
Elora did not flinch at the magnitude of the money, only at the brutal clarity of the transaction. She looked directly at Adrian, not with awe, but with a strange, cold assessment.
"And if I fail to adhere to the terms, mister?" she asked.
"The non-disclosure penalties are severe. You will lose everything and face civil action," he replied.
"And if you fail to adhere to the—"
Adrian was unaccustomed to being challenged on his adherence to rules. "That will not happen, but hypothetically, the contract provides for triple the remaining compensation. However, I value control above all else. This contract guarantees—" Elora signed the document. Her hand was steady. She was selling 2 years of her identity for freedom. Adrian saw her not as a person, but as the perfect mechanism for managing external perception. He had established absolute control. The introduction to society was masterful. Elora, coached by Adrian's chief of staff, learned quickly.
She mastered the art of polite, non-committal conversation, how to wear millions of dollars of jewelry with casual ease, and how to project a calm, devoted deference to her new husband.
But the cracks began appearing not in public, but in the unnervingly silent expanse of the penthouse.
Their lives were meticulously partitioned. They ate dinner separately, Adrian working in his study, Ilara reading in the library.
Yet, sometimes, late at night, when the city was a quiet, electric pulse beneath them, they would collide in the kitchen.
One night, Ilara was attempting, poorly, to assemble a complex piece of furniture she had bought for her mother's new apartment, now paid for by Adrian's money.
Adrian, retrieving a late-night black coffee, found her surrounded by diagrams and hex keys, muttering frustratedly to herself. He watched her for a moment. She looked tired, her expensive public mask completely gone.
"You are assembling that incorrectly," he observed, without emotion.
Ilara looked up, startled. "I am aware. The instructions assume competence.
Adrian did not offer help. He simply walked over, picked up the diagram, and pointed a long finger at a connection point. You transposed steps 5 and 6. The lateral support must be fixed before the vertical pillar. You are working against.
He said nothing else, took his coffee, and returned to his study. The next morning, Ilara found the piece of furniture assembled perfectly, sitting silently in the hallway, waiting to be shipped. No note, no acknowledgement. Just the silent, efficient application of capability.
This became their strange language. He began leaving technical journals he had finished on her reading table. She started placing his favorite obscure Earl Grey tea bags next to his machine before he woke.
They were communicating through curated gestures, ignoring the contract that defined their distance.
Adrian, who had built his empire on avoiding the messy irrationality of emotion, found himself mildly unsettled. He realized he enjoyed having her quiet presence in the house. Her practicality cut through the sycophancy that usually surrounded him.
She treated him, paradoxically, not like a billionaire, but like a complex, slightly irritating project.
The 2-year mark was approaching fast. The Omnicorp merger was finalized, the board was appeased, and the stock had stabilized. Adrian had achieved his goal. He could end the contract. He sat in his study one evening, the termination papers spread out before him. All he had to do was sign and present them. The financial payout was enormous, guaranteeing Ilara's comfort for life. It was the logical, controlled conclusion. But he found he could not lift the pen.
The thought of the penthouse reverting to its previous sterile silence was suddenly intolerable.
The thought of never seeing the subtle, almost imperceptible lift of her brow when she found one of his absurdly complicated investment memos fascinating left a hollow feeling in his chest, a feeling Adrian Vance was not supposed to possess.
He wanted to offer a renewal, a modification. He wanted to offer a real relationship. He wanted to discard the premise that had brought them together, hoping the residual reality could sustain them.
One night, after a particularly tense corporate event, where Ilara had masterfully navigated a sticky journalistic inquiry, they returned late. The unspoken tension between them was palpable, thicker than the expensive air they breathed.
They stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights cold and distant beneath them. Ilara finally spoke, her voice low.
"The contract is almost done, Adrian. I have the papers for the dissolution." Adrian turned to face her. The emotional control he had cultivated for decades began to fissure.
"Tear them up, Ilara," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a command born of desperation.
She stared at him, her pragmatism warring with something softer, something uncertain.
Because the premise was temporary. The reality is, it was an unprecedented surrender of control. He was admitting that the greatest asset he had ever acquired was the one he had tried hardest to keep at arm's length.
The line was crossed that night. It was not a grand, dramatic declaration of love, but a quiet, mutual recognition that the charade had consumed the actors, leaving only the truth behind.
They were married in the eyes of the world. Now they were married in reality. Adrian destroyed the original contract, symbolically crushing the last vestige of the transaction that had defined them. He felt a profound sense of liberation.
He had finally allowed himself to be vulnerable, to trade control for connection. 3 months later, the universe delivered its brutal, ironic counterstrike.
Alara had been feeling unwell, dismissing it initially as stress. Adrian insisted on a comprehensive medical review, his need for optimization extending even to her health.
The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Adrian was in a board meeting, presenting the Q2 financials. His private line flashed on the console. It was Dr. Shen, his longtime personal physician. Adrian excused himself, walking into the adjoining private conference room. The room was soundproofed, the walls draped in rich, absorbing velvet. It was designed for secrets.
Adrian, I have the results for Ilara. Dr. Shen's voice was professionally measured, almost too calm.
Is everything? Adrian asked, expecting a routine confirmation of minor fatigue.
The tests confirm she is approximately 12 weeks pregnant. Congratulations.
A momentary, overwhelming euphoria flooded Adrian. A child. A legacy not just of finance, but of blood, of continuation. It was the one thing he had never thought he needed, but now realized he desperately wanted.
He smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that rarely touched his face.
Thank you, Doctor. We are both very...
Dr. Shen paused. The pause stretched, heavy and unnatural.
Adrian, there is a second matter. A procedural inconsistency I need to address, related to your...
Adrian's smile vanished. He felt the cold touch of suspicion. What?
I was reviewing Alara's prenatal workup alongside your own comprehensive medical profile, specifically related to the fertility waiver you signed when you were 30. It prompted me to check the full trauma report from your accident at 18. You never requested those specific records.
Adrian remembered the accident dimly, a severe collision during his freshman year of university. Months of recovery.
He had been told there were internal injuries, but nothing specific regarding fertility was ever discussed in detail with him personally. He had assumed, as a young man, that everything had healed.
What does the trauma report say? Adrian asked, his voice returning to the flat, corporate tone he used to buffer emotional shocks.
Adrian, the damage to the reproductive system was extensive and irreparable. You were diagnosed as clinically sterile immediately following the surgeries, a fact confirmed by the subsequent testing we did for the insurance waiver year.
The room went silent. The velvet walls absorbed the air, making it hard to breathe. The cold fact, delivered in a clinical monotone, hung in the space between the earpiece and Adrian's mind.
He did the math instantly, flawlessly, without requiring a calculator or a second thought. Ilara was 12 weeks pregnant. He had destroyed the contract and started a real relationship with her approximately 3 months prior.
3. If the child was 3 months along, the conception had occurred precisely at the inflection point, the time when they were still officially a contractual marriage, before they had crossed the threshold of intimacy, before Adrian had surrendered control.
The child was not his. It was an impossible reality. Adrian Vance, the master strategist who controlled market forces and corporate maneuverings, had been outmaneuvered by biology, by timing, and by the fragile, messy reality of the woman he loved. He felt no immediate anger, only a chilling, devastating clarity. The silence returned, deeper this time. It was the sound of his entire world being systematically dismantled, brick by silent brick.
Thank you, Doctor. Adrian finally managed. The professionalism remained, a shield against the internal devastation. I appreciate the discretion. We will discuss this.
He hung up, placed the phone deliberately back on the console, and remained standing in the soundproof room. He felt nothing, except the terrifying recognition that he had lost the control he valued most, and with it, his identity.
He had risked everything on a foundation of genuine feeling, only to discover that the foundation itself was built on sand.
He walked back into the board meeting. He completed his financial presentation, answering complex questions about asset allocation and projected growth rates with absolute precision.
No one noticed the microscopic tremor in his hand, or the sudden Arctic stillness in his eyes.
He waited until evening. He needed facts before emotions. He needed to understand the timeline from Alara's perspective. He refused to allow suspicion to poison his love until he had exhausted every logical explanation, however improbable.
Alara was in the library when he returned, reading a first-edition novel. She looked up and smiled, a soft, expectant smile of shared intimacy. She reached out her hand.
Adrian did not take it. He stood opposite her, the mahogany desk between them, the same desk where the original controlling contract had been signed.
"We need to talk about the pregnancy, Ilara," he stated, his voice devoid of inflection.
Alara's smile whitened. "I know. Dr. Shen called me earlier. Isn't it?" "It is," Adrian agreed. "But there is a—" He did not speak of the infertility directly. He chose the most sterile, least accusatory route possible.
When we transitioned from the contractual relationship to a real one, there was an overlap in time, he began. A window when we were technically still operating under the old terms, but had not yet become physically.
Alara's expression shifted, the joy fading into cautious realization.
"How long was that window?" she asked, her voice dropping.
Approximately 4 weeks. It was during that time the Omnicorp negotiations were critical, and we were maintaining separation. The dates coincide precisely with the conception timeline given by Dr.
He paused, letting the cold mathematics settle between them.
"The child is due exactly 9 months from a point where we were not."
Alara's face went white. She did not immediately deny it. She did not immediately argue. The genuine shock in her eyes was more devastating to Adrian than any immediate accusation of deceit would have been.
She started, then stopped, searching for words she clearly had not expected to need.
When you signed the contract, you were still maintaining connections from your previous life, Adrian prompted, guiding her with clinical precision.
She nodded slowly. Yes, there was someone, right before the contract started. A friend. It was over, entirely over before I moved in. I didn't see him again. It was a single night, Adrian. It meant nothing. I assumed, when things changed between us, that it was ours. I didn't even conceive of the possibility that the timing could be so.
"So," Adrian finished for her.
He pulled the medical file out of his briefcase. He did not slam it down. He merely slid it across the desk toward her.
"Dr. Shin confirmed today, Ilara. I have been sterile since I was 18. This child cannot be mine."
Ilara opened the file. She saw the clinical reports, the undeniable truth written in medical terminology. She looked up at Adrian, and tears finally welled in her eyes, not of manipulation or sorrow, but of profound, terrible realization.
Adrian, I swear to you I didn't know, she whispered, her voice breaking. When I realized I was pregnant, there was never a doubt in my mind it was ours. I dismissed the previous month entirely. I was so—
Adrian looked at the face of the woman he loved, the woman who had brought unexpected warmth and chaos into his meticulously ordered life. He saw the genuine horror of her mistake, the accidental betrayal woven into the fabric of their transition from fake to real. This was the final, irreversible event.
Adrian had lost control, not to a hostile takeover or a market crash, but to a twist of biological fate that occurred during the brief, unguarded moment when he believed the contract was still governing their lives.
He had a choice that was agonizingly simple from a corporate standpoint and utterly impossible from a human one.
The corporate choice: file for immediate dissolution, expose the truth privately to the board, that the marriage was a failure, a transaction that yielded a compromised asset, protect his name, his empire, and his ego.
Erase Ilara and the child from his life. The human choice: accept the lie, embrace the child. Stay with the woman who had fundamentally changed him, knowing that the most profound connection they shared was founded on an impossibility. Adrian walked to the window. He looked out over the glittering, impersonal skyline of the city he owned. He had always defined himself by what he controlled: assets, outcomes, risks. Now, standing on the precipice of losing everything he truly valued, the quiet companionship of Ilara,
He realized that true strength lay not in demanding control, but in choosing commitment over self-preservation.
If he left, he would revert to the sterile, isolated existence he had before. He would reclaim his perfect narrative, but he would be hollow. If he stayed, he would live a private lie, a biological paradox, but he would keep the family he had fought for, however inadvertently.
He turned back. Ilara was weeping silently. The medical report crumpled beside her hand. She did not plead. She merely waited for the sentence.
You should know, Ilara, Adrian said, his voice flat but steady, that the timeline is not what defines the relationship. The contract was terminated when I tore up the papers. The reality began that...
He walked around the desk and knelt beside her chair, an unprecedented physical humility. We are building a life together. Not a legacy, not a corporate structure.
He took her hands. I am not concerned with whose blood runs through the child. I am concerned with whose name the child will carry, and whose father will be there when they wake up in the...
He looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. We will raise this child, Ilara. We will raise them as Vance. We will never speak of this outside this room.
His decision was not driven by blind emotion, but by a ruthless application of emotional logic. He loved Ilara. That love was more valuable than his pride or the purity of his bloodline. He chose to substitute genetic control with environmental control. He would mold the environment of their lives, protecting this new, fragile reality at all costs. The next few weeks were a masterful exercise in misdirection and narrative management.
Adrian called an unscheduled board meeting. He did not announce the pregnancy. Instead, he presented a detailed plan for an immediate temporary sabbatical.
The integration of Omnicorp required an extreme expenditure of resources, both corporate and personal, Adrian explained, standing before the skeptical faces of his board. My physician has advised a period of reduced exposure.
I will be stepping back from the direct CEO role for 18 months. I will remain chairman, accessible for critical strategy, but the day-to-day operations will be handled by...
Marcus Sterling, his highly competent second-in-command, looked surprised but nodded assent.
Roger Thorne was immediately suspicious. A sabbatical at the height of the market? This is unacceptable, Adrian. The shareholders will
be informed that I am taking time to focus on a growing family and necessary health optimization, Adrian countered smoothly. The market values stability, Roger. The perception of a dedicated family man prioritizing well-being will, ironically, stabilize our valuation far more than the image of a workaholic CEO nearing...
He was using the future child as a corporate shield. He was crafting a public narrative designed to protect his private truth.
He was sacrificing the raw power of the CEO title, the ultimate symbol of his control, to protect the personal life that now mattered more.
It was an ingenious move. He created the narrative that the family necessitated the retreat, burying the actual biological inconsistency under layers of corporate necessity and public virtue.
The transition was successful. Adrian and Ilara retreated almost entirely from public life, moving from the glittering penthouse to a secluded estate in upstate New York, far from the suffocating scrutiny of Manhattan. The birth of the child, a boy named Elias, brought a profound, final silence to the lingering doubts Adrian had harbored.
Holding the infant, smelling the unique, clean scent of a newborn, Adrian felt the complete erasure of the distinction between biological father and actual father. The love was immediate, uncompromised, and absolute.
He would watch Ilara with Elias. He saw the way she handled the burden of the secret, never wavering, never referencing the truth they shared only in silence. She was an extraordinary woman, and Adrian felt a fierce pride in her strength. Years passed. Adrian had embraced the role of fatherhood with the same intensity he had once applied to hostile mergers. He was meticulous, present, and deeply invested. Elias grew up strong, energetic, possessing a joyful recklessness that was certainly not Adrian's.
Adrian rarely thought about the man who was the biological father. That man was a ghost,
a forgotten variable in a contract that had long been shredded. Adrian had claimed the child, legally, emotionally, and socially. He was Vance. He understood now that control had never been the objective. Control was merely the mechanism Adrian had used to manage fear, the fear of vulnerability, the fear of chaos.
When he finally chose love, he chose chaos, but found in it a strange, unshakable peace. One rainy afternoon, Adrian sat on the veranda, watching Elias, then 6 years old, struggling to build a complex structure with wooden blocks. Elias looked up, his brow furrowed in frustration, and called out,
"Dad, it keeps falling down. The base isn't strong."
Adrian walked over and knelt beside him. He remembered the furniture Alara had struggled with years ago.
"The goal is not to force it, Elias," Adrian said softly, helping him stabilize the cornerstone. "The goal is to understand where the weakness lies and adjust the structure around it. Sometimes the strongest support comes from the most unexpected."
He realized he was not talking about the blocks. He was talking about the life they had built, a life founded on a contradiction, supported by sacrifice, and secured by an uncompromising choice.
Adrian Vance had stepped down from the peak of his ambition, surrendering the daily control over his financial empire, to become simply Adrian, the man who chose the unpredictable truth of commitment over the sterile security of control.
He had traded billions for a silent, profound understanding that genuine life begins only when the contract ends. He looked at Elias, then toward the house where Ilar was watching them. He saw the love, the commitment, and the quiet shadow of the shared secret.
The price of control, he had learned, was isolation. The price of peace was the constant, necessary maintenance of a life built on an impossible foundation.
Adrian Vance successfully engineered the largest emotional acquisition of his life by sacrificing his own legacy. But what happens to a man who must live every day in the shadow of a biological truth he deliberately chose to suppress?
The price of peace, as Adrian would soon learn, is not paid once, but every morning he looks into the mirror.
Next time, we examine the chilling psychological consequences of a life deliberately lived in shadow, and the moment the corporate empire Adrian abandoned begins to whisper the truth he thought he had buried forever.